have a presentation that Madeline wrote and that Linda would be so kind to read. And, it looks like this is going to be the last one today. And they didn't prepare to actually read it, but I have it here, and I thought that because so many of you, have been we've all been very invested in hearing these wonderful presentations that you've been doing these last few years, that I asked if it would be okay and Linda wants to just be at a meeting where she can relax. It's been a few years since she's been able to do that. So I said, okay, and I asked if it would be okay if I would read some from what Madeline wrote up, and we'll just that way we can come full circle on it, and I'll post this up on the website so everybody can read it, the full text. But I just feel like it gives, this particular one gives some background on Madeline and her family and the connection to Nelson, and I just thought that you guys would want to know that, so I'm just going to go for it, okay? Or parts of it. Okay, so this one's called Remembrances of Nelson, Eddy Jeanette MacDonald, and My Father. I recall mostly with joy what I still remember about Nelson, my father's relationship with Nelson, and references to his Jeanette. For what it is worth, I thought it might be interesting to document some of my recollections only because what I know from my perspective is unique to me, since I was alive and witnessed or heard what might be of interest to the current generation. I begin with an introduction of my father's activities, which led up to his association with Nelson. See, I think this is interesting, Madeline. People should know, how, because this is the whole history of MGM, Around 1925, my father was a policeman. My mother was not pleased with that, and in so many words told him that if he wanted to stay married and see his children grow up, she suggested he find a less dangerous occupation. Sufficiently motivated, he looked around, and Metro-Goldwyn-Mayer's studio was building a new studio in Culver City. At that time, we lived in a suburb of Los Angeles, adjacent to Culver City, identified as Palms. MGM was seeking employees, and he applied for a position they had open to drive and maintain a camera car. My father was an excellent mechanic and more than qualified for the job. It was MGM's rule that if you drove a conveyance for them, you were also responsible for its maintenance. Dad got the job. Okay, excuse me. I actually have a couple of photos of my dad in this car with the crew, and the license plate at that time bore the date of 1927. My dad was basically an inventor. He had a patent on a siren that he invented that was powered by the engine of the automobile itself. It was the first of its kind. Heretofore, sirens were cranked by hand. Okay, let me see here. Okay, it was in 1927 that Warner Brothers introduced Al Jolson in a movie that talked, quote unquote. All of the studios except MGM were eager to have this new technological advancement. My dad was already a ham radio operator and had begun dabbling in making recordings. As soon as he heard about a more advanced technology that would permit them to record sound directly on film, he was hooked. It would eliminate the ponderous need to make disc recordings except for playback needs. He began to plead his case for transfer to the infant, quote, sound department, and sometime in 1929, Dad had successfully transferred to this new department as a sound man. It was also in 1929 that the singing star Jeanette MacDonald was brought to Paramount Studios in Hollywood from the Broadway musical comedy stage. Norma Shearer, a very influential movie star at MGM, saw the opportunity to get her young brother a job, and she used her influence with Louis B. Mayer to appoint him the recording director. The fact that he was not really qualified was not important to Mayer, but it kept Norma off his back. But in those early days, there were very few people who could be considered as qualified, so it did not seem to matter too much at the time. Meanwhile, my dad kept working on his own equipment at home, to improve disc recording. Virtually every evening and on weekends, Dad could be found working on his equipment while at the studio. He threw himself into developing the recording technique of going directly to recording on film itself. Support from Mayer was minimal, but it did not seem to deter my dad or others struggling to perfect the technique, which would ultimately revolutionize motion pictures. Enter Nelson Eddy. Nelson signed his first contract with MGM in mid-1933. Nelson had a lot of time on his hands as the studio was not prepared with anything for him to do. As Nelson began to familiarize himself with the studio, he was particularly interested in the status of film recording. In that pursuit, he learned that my dad had built his own recording equipment, and he made it a point to meet him. He did catch up with my dad, who invited him to come over to our home and see and hear what he had built. If my memory is accurate, Nelson came over on a Saturday afternoon as the employees, including actors and actresses, were all required to work 5.5 days unless they were needed for a full Saturday. I still recall very vividly that day when I answered the doorbell of our home in Cheviot Hills. As youngsters were inclined to do, I dashed to answer the bell. When I opened the door, there stood the most handsome man I had ever seen. To my surprise, Nelson saw I was a girl and quickly removed his hat. I hope my mouth was not open, but I did gape at him. He did not seem to notice my confusion, but said, "Hello, my name is Nelson Eddy, and I'm here to see Mr. Bayless." Dad had told my mother that a man from the studio was coming over that afternoon, so he was not unexpected. What was unexpected was that he was so handsome. But it was a different male handsome than we were used to seeing. The image of a handsome man in those days was of a Clark Gable type. Mr. Eddy looked nothing like that. I was struck by his extremely fair coloring, and that included his brows and lashes and sideburns, which were virtually white. He had dark blue eyes, a delightful manner, and a wonderful smile. His wavy hair was thick, and in those days we would have called it strawberry blonde. But even then he had a streak of white running through it. Handsome he was, but he was also different and very appealing. I immediately invited him in and to follow me down the hall to where my father could be found. As Nelson followed me, I called out, "Daddy, Daddy, Mr. Eddy is here." Now, I am sure Nelson was used to introductions, but that was probably a little unusual even for him. Thus began a business association and a friendship between my father and Nelson. During this first visit, my father showed Nelson what he had built into the oversized closet that was attached to my brother's bedroom. There was a speaker system in the bedroom and another larger system in our living room. Dad gave him a demonstration of the quality of his equipment was capable of delivering. Apparently, Nelson was intrigued enough that he set up a second meeting to come back and discuss and define what he was seeking. After that happened, Nelson became a regular visitor to our home and worked with our father, starting with how Nelson intended to use the equipment. Dad soon learned about who Nelson was as a classical music artist and how well he was known in the concert and opera worlds, but is yet unknown in the film industry. Nelson and Dad decided on exactly what Nelson required, and Nelson was eager for Dad to begin work on his equipment while he left on his contract-approved concert tour for 1934, beginning in February through April, which was to take 3 months. I myself have no knowledge of the money arrangement, but in those days we were a cash society. Credit cards did not exist, or even a personal check was very unusual. In those Depression days, this arrangement with Nelson was a welcome supplement to the studio's meager salary paid to their technicians. Mayer was a well-known penny pincher, and at that time, unions were not a factor that they would soon become. I tell you honestly that Nelson's contribution to our household helped us through those dark Depression days. It helped us to maintain a roof over our heads, put food on the table, and school clothes to wear for my brother and me. At the time this was going on, I was really unaware of this monetary relief until I was old enough to appreciate it. Nelson was generous to us, but not foolish about his money. He had worked hard for it. When Nelson came over to our house, he usually brought with him a record or two that he had made at the studio. These sessions were interesting and, in fact, a lot of fun. Dad would play the records and insist that Nelson sing with himself while he recorded the two voices. It was Dad's way of beginning to teach Nelson to sing in perfect synchronization with himself. Nelson would stand by the window and microphone in my brother's bedroom, facing my dad, who was in the closet where the equipment was located. When Nelson sang with a record of himself made at the studio, it was glorious. I can't count the number of times I heard him sing the Carlo. That's from Student Tour.
Yeah.
Otherwise, Nelson had no accompanist, so he sang a cappella. The first time we heard him sing, Mother, Jimmy, and I were in the kitchen. We looked at one another, and my mother laughed and commented, "I wonder what the neighbors think about this glorious voice." My brother responded, "They are getting a free concert." We felt sure he could be heard a block away. Actually, Dad was teaching Nelson the foundation technique for recording on film, to sing with the playback of oneself when the actual filming of the scene was photographed. The trick was to do it in perfect synchronization. While Nelson was on tour, Dad continued to work evenings and weekends on Nelson's equipment. When Nelson returned, Dad was to find out that Nelson had a bright and inquiring mind, and it was not enough to know what buttons to push, but he wanted to understand what actually happened when he did that. Dad quickly recognized that Nelson was a remarkable student and a pleasure to teach. Nelson paid attention to what Dad was telling him, and he absorbed everything. It was a rewarding process for both of them. When Nelson got the opportunity to play the leading male role in Jeanette MacDonald's new film, Naughty Marietta, he was thrilled. Production on the film began in November of 1934. After a bit of a rocky start, Jeanette suddenly changed her manner with Nelson and was soon teaching him what he needed to know. Even their director, Woody Van Dyke, was quick to notice her interest in Nelson and vice versa, so he made the most of it. When Nelson began work on Naughty Marietta, there were the duets to consider. This is when Dad saw even more value in this equipment for Nelson. He brought to Nelson's attention that if there was one factor that duet singing for film had always lacked, it was for the singers to sing perfectly together. He also told Nelson that his partner, quote unquote, was used to singing solo and rarely ever sang a song twice the same way. Nelson nodded his agreement, but quickly pointed out that he was a newcomer to films and in no way did he want to disturb his co-star partner. He was still astounded that Jeanette had fought to have his name be with hers above the film's title. Indeed, it shocked many of the people on the MGM lot. When the film turned out to be so successful, they quickly changed their tune. At that juncture, Dad pointed out that Jeanette really did want to be perfect, but she just did not have the musical training and skill that Nelson had acquired in his years of musical education and his performing. However, Dad made it clear that it was up to Nelson to figure out how to approach this delicate situation with Jeanette if he wanted their duets to be as perfect as possible. Nelson's approach turned out to be just what Jeanette needed. It was for Nelson to sing with her over and over. It not only had the desired effect musically, but also allowed them to become close on a personal level. Jeanette was soon to learn that just taking voice lessons made for dull singers, and that she was missing out on what Nelson called the joy of singing. Nelson's answer was to invite her to his home for small gatherings that were usually made up of musical people. She would also invite Nelson to her home for dinner, and they spent the evenings singing together. They loved to play with the new recording equipment and record themselves. Jeanette was excited to do it because it was all new to her. Nelson took advantage of the situation to work with her, but very carefully and with diplomacy. Another interesting sidelight was when they began working on the recording stage to record their songs. Herbert Stothart, the music director, quickly recognized Nelson's professional talent and how well Nelson seemed to work with Jeanette MacDonald. At the time, she had a reputation for being a bit difficult to handle, but to Stothart's delight, Nelson literally took over the recording sessions, and Jeanette followed Nelson's lead. The release of Nelson's first film on March 29, 1935, Naughty Marietta, in which he was starred with Jeanette MacDonald, he became an overnight sensation. But it was his concert tour in 1935 that he found very disturbing. Those film fans that did start to come to his concerts after the picture was released, and the antics of these new film fans actually disturbed him. He told Dad that he did not understand all of the ruckus that went on, and his other concert friends did not have this problem. Little did he know, it was only the beginning of what it meant to be a star. Dad told Mother that he refrained from saying anything because he found it rather appealing that Nelson was so naive about the female gender's attraction to him. Even Jeanette was quoted as saying that Nelson had no idea of his effect on women. At first, my dad was concerned about Nelson's obvious interest in Jeanette. He thought she might divert him from his classical music career goals. Dad made it clear to Mother that Nelson was a refined, cultured, and well-educated man, unlike most of the men Jeanette had encountered. Soon, Jeanette herself commented that Nelson was different. He soon had the reputation on the MGM lot as a, quote, real gentleman, especially in the way he treated the ladies, as ladies. He rejected the publicity department's attempt to pair him with, quote, starlets, as it became obvious that his only interest was limited to Miss MacDonald. I hasten to say that Nelson and Dad's sessions were often filled with a lot of fun. Nelson had a delightful sense of humor, and he was a pleasure to be around. Dad would play the recordings he brought with him and insist that Nelson sing with himself while Dad recorded the two voices. Listening to himself permitted Nelson to catch the flaws between the two renditions. My dad took advantage of Nelson's eagerness to understand the complex equipment and how to make sure it was performing as expected. To that end, he made up a kit of replacement vacuum tubes with a schematic as to where they were located in the equipment. He also gave Nelson a unit by which he could run a test to make certain they were all functioning properly. Remember, transistors were years away from being invented. Vacuum tubes were expendable, and if one failed, the equipment would fail. With the backup kit, Nelson quickly learned how to run his test and replace any tubes that were faulty or near failure. This saved him from being embarrassed by a breakdown when he was using the equipment himself or with his friends. Dad always made sure that the kit was replenished with any tubes Nelson had used. He even had the backups for the backups, because certain tubes which provided the power were drained more quickly. A phone call from Nelson to Dad was all it took if he had an urgent problem. Those calls were few and far between, and Nelson only called if he was having a party and his musical friends looked forward to recording themselves. Nelson usually invited Jeanette to these gatherings, and she soon realized how much enjoyment it could be to sing with high-caliber artists. The only thing I recall is that Dad thought it was notable and told my mother that unless Jeanette had a studio car and driver, Nelson would pick her up and take her home because Nelson had concerns about letting Jeanette drive at night. That situation regarding her night driving was one that lasted a lifetime. When Nelson learned that he was to make Rosemary with Grace Moore, he was upset because he wanted to work with Jeanette. He came down with a series of ailments that delayed starting the film until Grace had to return to the Met. Then Stromberg signed Jeanette for the leading role, and Nelson was delighted. I recall when that was a done deal, he asked my father about Tahoe, as Dad had told him we had been up to the lake just a few years ago. Dad spoke in glowing terms about the beauty of the place. I would like to relate a delightful little story about Nelson's trip and a keepsake I had for a number of years until in one of our moves, it and other things became lost. Christmas of 1933 and 34, we had received lovely Christmas cards from Nelson. But Christmas of 1935, instead of a card, we received what appeared on the outside to be just a letter. When Mother opened it, we found something delightful. Nelson, always full of surprises, as Jeanette knew only too well, surprised us. Inside the envelope was a page from Nelson's Rosemary script. When we ultimately did see the finished film, we could figure out if this scene was in the film, and it was. It was the scene where they had arrived at the top of the mountain, about 8,000 feet, where the love scene was ultimately shot. Our page is the lead up to that scene. He asks if she wants to camp here, and she offered to build the fire herself. Nelson had taken a red crayon and wrote his Christmas greeting to us as a family across the face of the page. How wonderful to think he would personalize his greeting. It did mean a lot more than a card that his secretary would have sent. He had even addressed the envelope in his own handwriting. They soon fell into the routine of practicing together before any recording sessions at the studio, sometimes at Jeanette's home or at Nelson's. Then they were comfortable singing with each other when they actually had to make the recordings or filming of the scene with the pre-recordings they had made. Over time, Jeanette began to follow Nelson's excellent sense of singing in sync with the pre-recorded song. This improved technique is what their audiences loved about listening to their duets. They were perfect. This routine of practicing their own stayed with them through all the films they made together. Even though the stories might have been a bit trite, the music was always beautiful to listen to and to watch them as they performed. It was this on-screen perfection that had never been achieved before that made this magical team become identified as America's Singing Sweethearts. Okay. This part's good too. Sorry, they're all good parts. Once Nelson had received the equipment Dad built for him, Nelson discussed with Dad the possibility of having Dad record what he sang on the radio. Nelson, the perfectionist, wanted to evaluate his own work. This started in 1934 with his Voice of Firestone appearances and continued for a number of years. Dad told him it was no problem, he just needed to know the date, time, and number of songs and where in the program. The only effect it had on our lives was if we ate our dinner before or after Dad finished the recordings. Dad always took the records to Nelson's house that same day or evening. He marked the recordings, 1, 2, 3, 4, etc., and the date. He left it to Nelson to write the song titles on the label. I hasten to note that Nelson did pay my father for doing this task that went on for a number of years. Now and then Dad would ask me if I wanted to go for a ride. In those days, a ride in the car was a treat. Often we would go, but as we approached Nelson's home, it was always preceded by a little lecture regarding my deportment with Mr. Eddy. The really important part of the lecture was to keep my responses short. Later, I found out that Dad knew that Nelson was unaware of girls my age and our proclivity to be chatterboxes. Hence the admonition to keep my comments brief and in order. What my Dad did not know was that Nelson's Jeanette was quite a chatterbox herself, and when she was with Nelson and feeling well. I also learned that Nelson had an infinite patience with Jeanette and seemed to enjoy her chatter. Upon our arrival, Nelson had told Dad to park under his lighted porch for safety reasons. This was one of the reasons Dad had no second thoughts about my waiting in the car. Dad would go up the few steps to the side entrance and ring the bell. It always seemed to me that Mr. Eddy immediately answered the door and eagerly awaited the records that Dad handed him. Mr. Eddy and Dad disappeared into the house. Of course, Nelson had no idea that I was in the car, nor did my father intend on telling him. Often from where I was parked, I could peek into the window of the breakfast room. I remember one time when Nelson's mother, Isabel, was busily arranging a beautiful bouquet of flowers that her son had brought home. Music was playing and Isabel was whistling along with it. My own mother whistled to music also, and I was amused that they both did the same thing. Nelson immediately wanted to listen to the recordings. He would listen to them in the order in which he had sung them. If he was satisfied, he would mutter, okay. Sometimes he would comment, could have been better. Or as a comment to his voice coach, who was often there, Dr. Lippy, quote, we'll do it your way next time. He never asked for Dad's opinion except as to how the record was from a technical standpoint, which Nelson was interested in knowing. I should have added that Dad timed his arrival so that Nelson had time to get home and have his dinner before he arrived. Sometimes Nelson and Ted would perform a song or two while they tried something out that Dad recorded on Nelson's equipment. Once Nelson happened to sing Old Man River from Jerome Kern's famous musical Showboat. Nelson exclaimed to Nelson that his performance of the song was magnificent and his radio audience would love to hear it. Nelson responded to Dad saying, "Jim, they tell me I should not sing the song because Paul Robeson had made the song famous and it belonged to that man." Dad instantly responded to Nelson saying, "It is an American song and you have every right to sing it." 2 weeks later, Dad was surprised when he recorded Nelson singing Old Man River on the radio program. As Dad predicted, it went over with resounding success with the radio audience. I suspect it tickled Dad that he had influenced Nelson to sing it. Etiquette of those days was that one always walked out with their guest or guests, to the person's car. Nelson always did so. Whenever I was with Dad, he and Nelson had finally finished speaking, Nelson made it a point to come to my side of the car. I was delighted to have the chance to speak with him because he seemed to me such a wonderful, kind, and warm-hearted man. He would give me that smile that would melt your heart and instantly address me by my first name in way of a greeting. Then came the usual questions that adults ask youngsters, but just to have his attention was enough for me. One time, Nelson was surprised that I was there and said, "Madeline, why didn't you come in? We could have had a party." That was typical Nelson. Sometimes he was dressed in his suit that he had worn for the broadcast, but on occasion he had removed his coat and tie and had his sleeves rolled up to his elbows. It gave him a relaxed appearance that I found both manly but boyish. Our conversation always seemed to end when he asked me to give my mother his very best wishes and be sure to say hi to my brother Jimmy. Here was one very important factor in the relationship my dad had with Nelson, and that was called loyalty, which meant a great deal to Nelson. The studio was a hotbed of individuals who would stoop to anything to further their own careers at the expense of others. Jealousy and competition was rampant among people who were under contract. It involved those at the highest levels of influence and permeated down through the ranks. Nelson was used to dealing with people who had a sense of integrity and ethical conduct in the music world. Those qualities were smothered in the studio atmosphere. We know that Nelson and Louis B. Mayer had an adversarial relationship, and although Mayer realized that his team brought in the money that allowed MGM to be the #1 motion picture studio in the world, he still resented Nelson and the love affair that he had with Jeanette MacDonald. Mayer was used to dealing with actors whose sole income was derived from the studio. He met his match when Nelson signed his contract. Nelson had a wonderful concert career, and although he enjoyed the extra income from MGM, he was not dependent on it, as were all the others. The result of this unusual situation was that Nelson refused to knuckle under to Mayer's draconian demands about how he lived his private life. Dad was often privy to the machinations that went on, particularly in the sound department, that were detrimental to Nelson. On occasion, Dad learned about some of the hanky-panky that Mayer and his cohorts were up to that did involve Nelson. Such incident involved Mayer himself. Mayer had contacts in Europe, especially with German filmmakers. The Germans were great engineers, and Mayer was told about a new microphone that they had designed and was considered superior to what MGM was utilizing, especially for music. Mayer recognized that Nelson was the superior singer, so he ordered Herb Stothart to purchase only one of the new microphones. Herb balked and insisted they would have to buy two, one for Jeanette, one for Nelson. Mayer refused to purchase one for Nelson, and nothing Herb could say or do would change Mayer's demand. He specifically told Herb that Jeanette was not to be told anything about a new microphone because the minute she found out about it, she'd immediately tell Nelson. Mayer was hoping this new mic would give Jeanette's voice an advantage over Nelson's. Further, he ordered Herb to have the prop department make special matching covers for each mic so that they would appear identical to Nelson and Jeanette. Herb fought against it, but he ultimately had to do as what he was ordered. Dad heard about this new mic, and in the course of working in the sound department, he also learned that it was supposed to be a secret from both Nelson and Jeanette. Dad was equally outraged that Mayer would do something that low to Nelson, but he also knew that Mayer had a vendetta against Nelson. Dad and Nelson had been working together for some time, and Dad felt a sense of loyalty to Nelson. At what Dad felt was an appropriate time, when he was at Nelson's home, he told him what was happening. But he made a special point to let Nelson know that neither did Jeanette know anything about the scheme. There was nothing Dad could do but just forewarn Nelson and hope that Nelson could figure out a way of examining the new mic and discover the substitution. It is my recollection that Nelson came up with a plan to admire the matching covers. Then he just happened to take the cover off Jeanette's mic. He immediately recognized that it was not the one they usually used. That led him to uncover his mic, and there they were, two different mics. Herb had to cover himself, so he told Nelson the new mic for him had not arrived, but was expected in the next few days. Mayer then had to let Herb phone for one more mic and have it flown to the studio. Meanwhile, Nelson and Jeanette sang no duets until Nelson's microphone arrived. Yay for your dad, Malin. In another instance, there was a second-rate actor who worked in B pictures, but thought he was God's gift to women in the film business. He worked to try to make friends with Nelson by soliciting Nelson's help about certain songs. Nelson always tried to help other singers if they asked him for help, and he did so with this fellow. Meanwhile, this fellow crucified Nelson to anyone who would listen to him as to how he was a far greater singer, better looking, a better actor than Nelson, and he should be getting the roles that Nelson received. His attacks behind Nelson's back were ludicrous, and most people just ignored him. Somehow he had heard that Dad built the recording equipment for Nelson. On that basis, he asked Dad to build a duplicate for him. Dad tried ignoring him, but the man was an absolute pest. I do remember Dad telling Mother that he would only build a duplicate of Nelson's recording equipment for him, quote, when hell froze over. He also said that, quote, if the guy lived another 100 years, he would never sing as Nelson did. Dad also knew about this man stabbing Nelson in the back and refused to give him the time of day. Dad was concerned that Nelson was oblivious to what this guy was doing in sabotaging Nelson. Soon the man was telephoning our house during the day to get my mother to influence Dad to build him the equipment. Dad was furious with his treatment of Nelson and that he would not take no for an answer. Dad told Mother to just tell him he had no time to take on any projects and hang up. Meanwhile, Dad had to think of a way to let Nelson know what was going on. Dad had heard this man shooting off his mouth very recently, and Dad mustered the nerve to tell Nelson about this phony who was not his friend. Nelson was surprised, but he was learning to be more careful about people who tried to associate themselves with him. He took Dad's word and immediately became too busy to ever help him again. Nelson returned the favor of loyalty when an employee of the studio tried to extort money from several of MGM's stars, including Nelson. In particular, he threatened to harm Nelson's mother, Isabel, if he was not paid what was demanded. Nelson hired a bodyguard for her to protect her until the case was resolved. The police finally determined that it was somebody who worked in the sound department, which brought every person employed in the department under scrutiny. Scrutiny involved that everybody in the sound department had to get a lawyer. Nelson found out that the police were looking at my father because of the fact that he was also working for Nelson outside of the studio. Nelson immediately interceded in behalf of Dad and gave Dad the money he had paid for a lawyer. He also convinced the police that my dad was not involved in this extortion scheme. The culprit, who was a recent new acquisition to the sound department, was soon discovered, and Nelson was able to release the bodyguard he had for his mother. Needless to say, both of my parents were relieved at the outcome and thanked Nelson for supporting Dad. Dad's actions were out of loyalty to Nelson and were very much appreciated by Nelson, and when the opportunity was at hand, he reciprocated. Nelson had no qualms about talking things over with Dad because he knew Dad could be trusted. Dad held Nelson in the highest regard for as long as he lived. As I recall, my father passed a couple of years or so before Nelson. I would like to comment that I never saw Nelson Eddy on screen until Naughty Marietta was released. When I first saw him singing Tramp, Tramp, Tramp in his coonskin hat, I recognized that he appeared quite different to me. I had always seen him in person without makeup or costumes and with his glasses. As the wonderful film continued, I was a bit taken back by all of the costumes and the makeup he had to wear and being without his glasses. I thought that in person he appeared more manly and handsome, but I soon became used to seeing him as he appeared on the screen. After my first glimpse of Jeanette, I had no doubt about why she meant so much to Nelson. She looked so beautiful on the screen, and they did sing well together. The opening of the movie with her and that little bird will always be my favorite. There was one time when Nelson and Dad emerged from his house, and they did not approach our car, but took off down the driveway to his garage. Nelson always kept his car in the garage, and my father did likewise. The difference being his was a beautiful car, and it was immaculate. Ours was a good but used car, but Dad kept it in excellent mechanical and physical condition. It was a few years before we reached the point of being able to purchase a new car every couple of years. It seems that Nelson had just purchased a new car, and he was eager to show it to Dad, whose mechanical expertise he was well aware of. They quickly had the hood open, were running the motor, and doing all of those things that boys and their toys engage in. Dad proclaimed the new car a beauty, and Nelson was grinning happily. I do want to say that Nelson was at ease in our modest home as he was in mansions. He did not forget where he came from. He usually came by close to dinner time on his way home from the studio. As he passed by our kitchen, our mother was busily preparing dinner. Nelson always stopped to chat for a few minutes with Mother. Early on, Mother was always a bit flustered by Nelson, but soon he captivated her with his warm and very friendly personality. Sometimes he would call out, "Gosh, Helen, something sure smells good." We knew that Nelson did like to eat. Nelson had known what it was like to be poor and sometimes hungry in his youth, but he did not dwell on it. He could be teasing my brother one minute to instantly paying close attention to what my dad was telling him the next. I remember his wonderful sense of humor and that singing just came naturally to him. That was just who he was. Nelson enjoyed a drink, but his choice was a good beer. Dad knew that early on, and he always kept at least 6 bottles of Nelson's favorite in our newly acquired and first refrigerator. He and Dad would often enjoy a nice cold bottle of that beer. My dad, however, got in trouble with my mother when she found out that Dad had not served Nelson's beer in one of our nice crystal Pilsner glasses, but just gave Nelson the bottle. Dad let my mother rave on to her conclusion. Then he informed her that that was the way they drank it at Nelson's house. That ended the subject. Nelson had a reputation at the studio of not being able to handle hard liquor, which was true. Clark Gable was always trying to push Nelson into trying to keep up with the crowd. Nelson soon learned that this was also a quick way to get in trouble with Jeanette. She remained a deterrent to his overdoing the drinking. Prohibition had ended on December 5th, 1933, so liquor was no longer illegal. I would be remiss if I did not comment about my dad's opinion of Nelson's mother, Isabel Kendrick Eddy, or as on her letterhead, Ike, I-K-E. My dad felt that Isabel was a dream of a mother, and Nelson was darn lucky to have her. In retrospect, I believe my father was taken with the affection and camaraderie between mother and son. They could banter back and forth, no holds barred. Isabel could hold her own with Nelson. Nelson adored her and told my dad that he was so grateful for all the years she had looked after him, schooled him, worked to put food on the table, but sometimes little of it, supported both of them, and encouraged his love of music, knew of his weaknesses and his strengths, and did adore his Jeanette. All this after her husband had deserted her and Nelson when he was just a boy. Desertion was the reason she had undergone the trauma of a divorce from her husband when she knew that divorce was a stigma hard to live down. It had a long-time effect on her son, but it had to be done. That is when Isabel's mother insisted she come to Philadelphia and live with her. The year 1939 began that dreadful turning point in Nelson Eddy's life. I still remember most vividly my father reading the morning newspaper on January 20th, 1939. Dad uttered an expletive and said, "What the hell has Nelson done?" Dad knew, as did most of Hollywood, that Nelson loved Jeanette, so this headline came as a shock, mostly to poor Jeanette, but to the entire studio. The studio was caught totally flat-footed, and the publicity department raced to try and respond to the clamor from the public. Most of Hollywood was well aware that Nelson and Jeanette were lovers and had been involved in their love since 1934. This news was inconceivable. My dad was so shocked at this news, and he usually ignored the wild things that happened in the movie business, but where Nelson was concerned, he was bowled over with this strange news. He had spent enough time with Nelson over the past years at his home and at the studio that Dad had no recollection of this woman he had married yesterday. He only knew that Jeanette and Nelson were lovers and had no idea of who this woman was that he married or even came from, where she came from. He told Mother that something was wrong, and it sounded to him like Nelson had been forced into this wedding and probably against his will. Dad, knowing Nelson so well, told Mother that Nelson was still naive about unscrupulous women who took advantage of male stars as a way of extorting money from them. It sounded like extortion to Dad, but to have this literally happen overnight also made it sound like some kind of funny business. By the time Dad got to the studio that day, it was the talk of the entire place. People just shook their heads, mostly in dismay, when they realized what this did to Jeanette. We later learned that it nearly destroyed her, since she had absolutely no inkling of this happening. The loss of their baby was tragic enough, but now this on top of everything? Yes, she knew that Nelson had spent hours with her last evening trying to get her to stay with their plans for her to go to Reno for her 6-week residency requirement and then file for divorce from Jean. Nelson, starting his concert tour, would come by after she had her divorce. He would pick her up and they would marry. Now all was lost. I do not remember which came first, Nelson's decision to leave MGM or my father's. They both did ultimately do it, but I think Dad made it out first. He recognized that as long as Norma Shearer and her deals with Mayer continued, no one in the sound department would ever get a single line of credit for all their contributions to film recording improvements as long as Douglas Shearer, Norma's brother, remained in charge of the department. MGM was the only studio that did not give credit to the people who did the work in the sound department. All credit was given to Douglas Shearer. Without credits, no one could ever build a reputation. No reputation, no promotions, no more money. It was a difficult decision for my dad, and he had long talks with my mother about what would be involved with leaving the security of MGM to go out on his own. I have no doubt that he and Nelson discussed their decisions, but Dad saw the opportunity and he was prepared to take the gamble. Of course, Nelson's stake was far greater, but Nelson felt that he could easily transition to another studio if he was able to buy out his contract. He knew Mayer would demand a small fortune before he would consent to giving up Nelson and losing his golden team. I believe Dad resigned his position at MGM around 1941 or so. Mother made it clear to my brother and me that we would have to make some sacrifices for a while before our father would be able to become regular. At first he worked for independent producers but kept seeking better opportunities. A few months later he learned that RCA was seeking a new manager for the RCA Victor recording studios and manufacturing facility in Hollywood. The current manager, who was retiring, was responsible for finding his own replacement, and there were a number of candidates, among them my dad. The manager hired my dad with the proviso that he would try him out for 6 months or so. Before the 6 months were up, Dad was hired to replace the retiring manager. It was while Dad managed this operation that he met Art Rush, who handled A&R, artists and repertoire. Later on, Art Rush became Nelson's radio and record manager. But before Dad took over the RCA operation, Nelson did not renew his RCA contract because the RCA main offices in New York City insisted that they select what their artists would record. Nelson objected to that arrangement, and Columbia offered him a contract that permitted him to make those decisions. It was only a matter of a few months between Nelson signing with Columbia and Dad taking over the RCA operation. In time, the powers that ran RCA decided to move that operation back to New York and wanted my father to relocate to New York so he could continue his position, albeit larger in scope. Both of my parents were native Southern Californians. Dad was born in Alhambra, my mother in Los Angeles. They discussed it and decided to remain here in California where our families were located. They hired the famous commercial architect Welton Beckett as their architect, and the unique Capitol Tower was conceived. This would be, seems like we're missing something here. Seems like there's a page missing. There's a page missing. Okay, so what's missing here is they decide to set up this part I know anyway. Capitol Records was formed, and they asked Jim Bayless to go and be, what was he, a vice president? Was he a vice president? Yeah. Vice president. So he ended up at Capitol Records. Okay. He ended up at Capitol Records as a vice president, and the building, she says here, was completed and opened in April of 1956. Yeah. It remains today the definitive icon of Hollywood. My dad worked closely with the designer of all areas involved with the recording studios and the other engineering aspects. Dad spent a lot of time in regards to the design and building of the subterranean reverberation chambers that were the latest innovation to be added to recordings. The main manufacturing plant was located in Scranton, Pennsylvania. The offices for the executives, president and 3 vice presidents, and their secretaries were all located on the top floor of the 13-story earthquake-resistant building. These men were each permitted to select the office with the view they liked the best. Dad chose the one that had the view of the Cahuenga Pass, which led to the San Fernando Valley where we lived. Dad remained Vice President of Engineering and Manufacture until his retirement in the 1960s. He had come a long way from the camera truck driver at MGM in 1925 to his ultimate success at the pinnacle of his career. I was always struck by the fact that both Dad and Nelson quit formal school at age 14. Dad was about 4 years older than Nelson, so they were from the same generation. Nelson had continued to educate himself in his field of music, and my father did the same in his engineering and administrative fields. Neither man could have achieved their respective places in their chosen fields without the dedication and hard work they devoted to their careers. They were both self-made men in that era. Nelson was ranked as the #1 American baritone during the 30s and 40s, and Dad was a highly respected executive in his. Neither man had a lazy bone in their body. No wonder they got along so well, and each had respect for the other. As a special note, Dad and Nelson would occasionally run into each other when Nelson was working in Hollywood in the 40s on Vine Street at the theater, where he did so many of his radio programs. I do know that Dad held Nelson in the highest regard as an artist and as a man of integrity, ethics, and principle. Nelson was delighted to learn that my father had made a success of his life, but leaving MGM was not a fortunate move for Nelson. After trying to deal with it for 8 years, he made another of his classic impulsive decisions. He not only cut himself off from the most important studio in the business, but his actions also impacted Jeanette's career. It was the age-old case of his making an impulsive decision that ended in unintended consequences and led to Mayer refusing to renew Jeanette's contract. That was definitely unintended. Mayer took the position that without Nelson he had no team and Jeanette was just excess baggage. Woody Van Dyke tried his best to deter Mayer from his decision based on all that Jeanette had contributed to the studio, but Mayer was only interested in the bottom line. When my father finally reached the mandatory retirement age of 65, Capitol Records had a great party for him and he was presented with a special LP record that acknowledged his contribution to the success of the company. The art department had designed a great cover that showed a photograph of the Capitol Tower and my dad. The title on the cover was "The House That Jim Built." Needless to say, I treasure that wonderful keepsake. Here's a picture of it.
Oh, isn't that nice?
Let's see. I'll show it to you guys afterwards. There's just a little tiny bit more. Dad was kept busy traveling to New York City for recording sessions and to Scranton to oversee the manufacturing facility. It also included destinations to Europe, now that Capitol was part of EMI. I recall that Jeanette MacDonald recorded the music for her Prima Donna TV show at the Capitol Tower located on Vine Street. When I pass by the tower, it is with fond memories as I remind whoever is with me, there's Dad's building. It's probably an overstatement, but so be it. Thus, this remains my story as well as one can recall what occurred such a long time ago. Certain events are still vivid, while others not so much, but it was fun to attempt to put memories into some kind of order as best I could. Thus, this remains, oh wait, that's repeated. Okay, that's the end of it, and I want to give her a hand.